The Mirror and the Fire, How Fear Becomes Empire. A Theology of Violence from Tel Aviv to Tehran, by Elias Winter, June 14, 2025. There are nations that remember, and there are nations that perform remembering. The first mourn, the second militarize. The first grieve, the second weaponize grief as justification for conquest. This is an essay about the second kind, about the kind of memory that becomes a gun, about the kind of fear that becomes an alibi, about the kind of history that is selectively embalmed, then revived, on demand, to sanctify the machinery of domination. It begins with fire, it ends with fire, but in between there is a mirror in which the victim sees his wound and, refusing to heal, turns it outward, onto the brown child in Gaza, the veiled mother in Qom, the teenager at the checkpoint who will never come home. A mirror in which the persecuted becomes the persecutor and does not blink. A mirror in which the sacred vow, never again, becomes an open-ended license for unending war. This is not an essay about Judaism. It is not about the Jews. It is about the Israeli state, its doctrine, its rituals, its choreography of fear. And it is about the empire behind it, the silence around it, and the theology beneath it. The theology that says, we are always the threatened ones. Therefore, whatever we do is necessary. But necessity is not truth. And victimhood is not a virtue when it is reenacted on the bodies of others. This essay is not for those seeking balance. It is for those seeking clarity. Because we live in an age where memory has been converted into spectacle, where trauma is sold wholesale as justification for asymmetric firepower, and where every ruined hospital is pre-excused by a word whispered in Washington, self-defense. This is the language of empire, post-Holocaust edition, and we will walk through its chapters, one by one, brick by brick, until the mirror cracks. Chapter 1. The Nakba and the Birth of Projection. Pre-1948. The Arab Threat to Jewish Survival. Empires are not born in the open. They are born in the heart, first as fear, then as permission. The Israeli state did not emerge from strategy alone. It emerged from a trauma so profound, so annihilating, that it burned into the collective nervous system of a people. We will not die again. And in that wound, sacred and unspeakable, lies the seed of what came next. Zionism did not begin as conquest. It began as return, as survival, as a desperate answer to centuries of humiliation, pogrom, exile, and finally, extermination. It was Europe, not Palestine, that made Zionism necessary. But when that necessity landed on the soil of another people, it did not confess the contradiction. It silenced it. And that silence became the origin of projection. From the beginning, Palestinian Arabs were not just neighbors. They were threats. In the eyes of the early Zionist imagination, shaped in the crucible of European anti-Semitism, Palestinians were cast in a pre-written role: the irrational hater, the violent mob, the Nazi in waiting. The settler saw in the native not a partner, but a portal back into his own trauma. And so he preempted, he fortified, he struck. Fear of annihilation became the lens through which all resistance was interpreted, not as objection to colonial imposition, but as confirmation of ancient hatred. And so in 1947, when partition was proposed and war erupted, the psychological groundwork had already been laid. The Nakba, the mass displacement of over 700,000 Palestinians, was not called conquest. It was not called ethnic cleansing. It was called defense. Villages were emptied. Families fled or were driven out. Names disappeared from maps. And still, the story told within the Israeli psyche was not one of aggression, but of justified deliverance. They would have done it to us. Therefore, we had to do it first. This is how projection works. It rewrites causality. It collapses nuance. It replaces the face of your neighbor with the mask of your nightmare. Fear of ethnic cleansing became the justification for ethnic cleansing. The Israeli state was born in this inversion. It was baptized not just in blood, but in righteous blood, the kind that washes away guilt before it dries. And that righteousness has never been rescinded. It has been institutionalized, ritualized, made holy through repetition. But holiness does not erase the dead. It only recasts them. The Nakba is not over. It continues in legal codes, in residency laws, in border controls, in demolition orders. It continues because the story that enabled it has never been interrupted. That story began with trauma, but it did not end in healing. It ended in permanent suspicion, a national theology that declared the world unsafe, the Arab untrustworthy, and every act of displacement a reluctant miracle. This is the birth of strategic projection, not a one-time betrayal, but the founding logic of a state. And like all founding logics, it would soon evolve. Chapter 2. The Theology of Defense. Post-1967. Greater Israel and the Sacralization of Fear. All empires tell themselves a story. And in the case of Israel, that story took on liturgical dimensions after 1967, when fear, already potent, was baptized into doctrine. The Six-Day War was a military triumph, but it was internalized as an eschatological escape from extinction. Surrounded by hostile Arab nations, Israel struck first, seized the Sinai, Gaza, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, the Golan Heights, and declared, "We survived again." But this time, survival metastasized. It did not return to the borders of necessity. It expanded into theology, into permanence, into a doctrine of permanent emergency. We cannot give it back. We cannot let go. We must never again be vulnerable. From this war, the logic of preemption became scripture. Fear became not just a feeling, but a justification for an entirely new geography. Settlements, checkpoints, occupation zones, security fences, secret prisons, assassinations. All in the name of prevention. Fear of displacement became a regime of displacement. The West Bank was not just land, it was a buffer. Gaza was not just territory, it was a test site. Every square kilometer became a moral argument. If we do not hold it, we will die. And so a new liturgy was born, recited by soldiers, by bureaucrats, by technocrats, by diplomats in Western capitals. We are small. We are surrounded. We are defending ourselves. But what they were defending was no longer life. It was a machinery of control. Palestinians, once neighbors, were now recast as infiltrators, terrorists, demographic threats. Even the unborn child in Hebron became a statistic in the calculus of fear. Would he grow up to stab, to throw, to reproduce? And so the logic hardened. Walls were built. Cities were carved up. Whole populations were monitored, mapped, profiled. Not because of what they had done, but because of what they might do. This is the theology of defense in its mature form. A state that sees in every Arab a potential erasure of the Jewish self. A theology that sanctifies asymmetry by invoking trauma. A theology that teaches its youth to shoot first, then remember later. And always the refrain, "We are forced to do this." Look at our past. We must be vigilant. But vigilance, once moral, had become metastatic. It no longer guarded life. It created a world in which life, for the other, was always provisional. And thus the state was no longer defending itself. It was defending its story. A story in which Palestinians could never simply be people. They could only be avatars of annihilation. A pregnant woman at a checkpoint? She might have a bomb. A student with a backpack? He might be carrying hate. A journalist? A camera can be a weapon. In such a theology, there is no room for innocence, only pre-guilt. And in such a theology, to question the checkpoints is to question the Holocaust. To question the fences is to endanger the Jews. To question the occupation is to delegitimize the state. This is not defense. It is sacrament. Fear made sacred. Violence made preventative. And memory turned into military strategy. What began as survival has become a fortress of the soul, one that no longer protects, but consumes. And this fortress would not stop with Palestine. It would travel. It would land in Lebanon. Chapter 3. Sabra, Shatila, and the War That Birthed More War. 1982. Lebanon, Preemption, and the Export of Fear. When fear is no longer localized, it becomes exportable. And in 1982, Israel exported it north. The justification was familiar. An imminent threat, a looming attack, terrorists at the border. But the real aim of the Lebanon invasion was not defense. It was engineering. Rewriting the political map of the region, installing a friendly Christian regime, and eliminating the PLO as a political and symbolic force. But the language used was surgical, holy. We must prevent the next war. We must stop terror before it reaches our homes. And so the Israeli Defense Forces pushed into Lebanon. Not for days, not for a border buffer, but for weeks, months, years. Cities flattened, civilian neighborhoods shelled, West Beirut encircled. And then came the massacre. Sabra and Shatila, two refugee camps on the outskirts of Beirut, densely populated, home to Palestinian civilians, women, men, children. The killing did not come directly from Israeli soldiers. It came from Christian phalangist militias, fueled by vengeance, armed with hatred, and given entry by the IDF. But the Israeli army did not stop them. They lit the perimeter. They flared the night sky so the slaughter could continue. Over 2,000 civilians were murdered, stabbed, raped, mutilated. Children lined up and shot. Pregnant women eviscerated. Infants crushed. And the world, for a moment, saw the truth. That preemption can be indistinguishable from annihilation. That self-defense, without restraint, becomes sadism. That the projection of fear can lead to actual genocide, even if outsourced. The Israeli government claimed it was a mistake, a tragic delegation. They hadn't known. But in 1983, the Kahan Commission found that Ariel Sharon, then defense minister, bore personal responsibility for allowing the massacre to occur. And yet he was not exiled. He would later become prime minister. Because in the logic of strategic projection, horror is always a misfire, never a pattern. We were trying to defend ourselves. We were trying to eliminate terror. We cannot be held responsible for the acts of others, only for our eternal vigilance. But here is the deeper truth. Fear of terror produced terror. Fear of extermination licensed extermination. And the logic of never again was turned outward, into a doctrine of anticipatory brutality. This is the grotesque symmetry of projection. The state that sees itself as victim becomes architect of victims. The state that fears camps creates them. The state that fears the ghetto walls erects them around others. And still, the narrative held. The West forgave. America increased aid. And the image of Israel as besieged democracy remained intact. Even as Beirut burned, even as bodies rotted in open camps, even as the trauma Israel once endured became the template for what it inflicted. This was no longer about borders. It was about identity, about exporting fear as moral necessity. And once the mechanism proved viable, it was institutionalized, codified, normalized. And by the time it returned home, to Gaza, it had evolved into ritual. Chapter 4. Gaza and the Doctrine of Cyclical Destruction. 2000s to the present. Mowing the lawn and the sacrifice of civilians. Empires have many euphemisms for cruelty. Rome called it pacification. America called it shock and awe. Israel calls it mowing the lawn. Nowhere is the doctrine of strategic projection more distilled, more nakedly ritualized, than in the ongoing siege of Gaza. A strip of land no larger than a mid-sized city, walled off from the world, patrolled by drones, and subject to the seasonal bloodletting of surgical bombardment. The story, again, is always the same. They fired rockets. We had to respond. We regret the loss of life, but our survival is not negotiable. But this is not defense. It is choreography. Every few years, sometimes months, Gaza is declared a threat. Hamas, the chosen villain, fires crude projectiles, largely ineffective, though no less traumatic for those living under them. In response, Israel unleashes a technologically orchestrated inferno. Airstrikes, tank shells, phosphorus, drones, and precision-guided missiles that, unfortunately, land on homes, schools, press buildings, hospitals. And each time, the pattern repeats. Step 1. A provocation, real or staged. Step 2. Escalation, framed as reluctant but firm. Step 3. Civilian death, framed as regrettable but necessary. Step 4. International outrage, brief, impotent. Step 5. Ceasefire, reset, silence, repeat. This is what Israeli generals openly call mowing the lawn, a term so banal, so suburban, that it exposes the surreal distance between the violence and the conscience. To mow the lawn is to assume the weeds will always grow back. It is to view the other not as human, but as overgrowth, recurring, unruly, and disposable. And so, a child playing in a courtyard becomes collateral. A journalist in a vest becomes a shield. A family sleeping in their home becomes a command center. Because the terror is embedded. Because they use human shields. Because we do not target civilians, but we cannot help it if civilians die. This is not the logic of accountability. It is the logic of divine right. Our fire is clean because our fear is real. But here is the central lie. The bombing of Gaza does not eliminate Hamas. It recruits for them. It does not end terror. It cultivates it. It does not create safety. It radicalizes generations. It turns rubble into memory. It turns grief into doctrine. It turns boys into fighters. Not because they are born hating Jews, but because they are born surrounded by ghosts. And on October 7th, 2023, the gates broke. After years, decades, of siege, of blackout, of starvation and humiliation, the cage finally cracked open. And what emerged was not a plan, but a scream. Hamas fighters stormed across the border and committed atrocities, murders, kidnappings, terror on a scale that horrified even their sympathizers. It was savage. It was real. It was trauma made flesh. But it was not unprovoked. When you cage a people for years, strip them of food, power, medicine, dignity, when you wall them off like diseased cattle and treat their lives as conditional, you should not be surprised when the gate opens and rage floods through. A starving dog does not negotiate. It bites. And Israel, knowing this, used the bite as its license. Within hours, Gaza was declared uninhabitable. Entire neighborhoods flattened. Aid convoys turned away. Journalists silenced. Over 57,000 killed, many of them children, many of them buried in mass graves. And through it all, the logic held. They brought this on themselves. Once again, fear becomes doctrine. Projection becomes policy, and mass death becomes self-defense. October 7th did not interrupt the cycle. It accelerated it. The siege became a purge. The projection became a floodlight. And the doctrine of mowing the lawn became something holier, something genocidal. Because if the lawn is not mowed, the jungle will grow. And in that jungle lives the ghost of European trauma, now cast in Arab skin. This is no longer policy, it is sacrament. And as with all sacraments, its logic does not end with the ritual. It seeks totality. So the fear must travel again. East, toward Tehran. Chapter 5. The Shadow of Iran and the Fear that Became Fire. 2020s to 2025. Tehran, assassinations, and the nuclear mirage. Projection matures into prophecy when it finds an enemy large enough to carry the full weight of your fear. For Israel, that enemy is Iran. Not Hamas in a cage, not Hezbollah at the border, but a sovereign nation, ancient, proud, theocratic, and imperfect, a rival with regional ambition, a state that, unlike the stateless Palestinians, can fight back, can speak back, can haunt back. And so Iran became the shadow beast in Israeli mythology, a monster of nuclear intent. A second Holocaust waiting to happen, a mushroom cloud in waiting. Never mind that Iran remained a signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Never mind that U.S. and Israeli intelligence repeatedly found no active bomb-making program. Never mind the clerical fatwas forbidding nuclear weapons as un-Islamic. The point was not truth. The point was terror. Because Israel's trauma required a mirror. And in Iran, it found not only a mirror, but a canvas. Dark-skinned, religious, apocalyptic, defiant. And so the rhetoric grew louder. They are months away. They seek our destruction. We cannot wait for the world to act. The prophecy wrote itself, and prophecy in statecraft is not a vision. It is a strategy. And so it began. Scientists murdered, shot in the street, blown up in cars. Cyber attacks launched, crippling infrastructure, sabotaging centrifuges. Sanctions tightened, with U.S. blessing, choking the economy. And finally, in 2025, missiles rained on Tehran, a strike cloaked in the language of defense, but executed as spectacle. Whole regions destabilized. And still, no bomb. Still, no proof. Still, no mushroom cloud. Just the ghost of one. Because what Israel feared was not a weapon. It was symmetry. a Middle Eastern nation that could deter it, that could strike back, that could refuse the asymmetry on which Israeli power depends. So Iran had to remain a monster, an unfinished Holocaust, a perpetual tomorrow. If we do not act, we will die. If we wait, we will be complicit. If we strike first, we are saviors. This is the full bloom of projection. Fear of genocide becomes license to kill. Fear of nuclear war becomes an excuse for permanent war. Fear of being erased becomes a campaign of erasure. But the campaign is not only military, it is rhetorical. It is spiritual. Iran is not just targeted, it is cast as irrational, suicidal, fanatical, just as Palestinians were cast as terrorists, just as Lebanese were cast as hosts for evil. The pattern repeats because it works. And in America, it is sanctified. Because in America, the Israeli fear story maps perfectly onto its own post-9/11 mythology. Preemption is protection. Dominance is defense. Dissent is betrayal. And so, the empire joins hands with its outpost. One speaks of freedom, the other speaks of survival. But both drop bombs. And Tehran burns. Not because of what it did, but because of what Israel could not bear to imagine. This is not security. It is exorcism, a ritual of fire meant to silence the ghost of vulnerability. And it is not over, because strategic projection is not a tactic. It is a theology, a worldview, one we must now expose in its totality. Chapter 6. The pattern itself, trauma as strategy, projection as policy. The moral machinery beneath the justifications. At the center of this empire of fear is not a policy, but a pattern, a choreography of historical trauma, strategically externalized. The pattern does not evolve, it repeats, because its purpose is not resolution, it is repetition. It sustains itself not on truth, but on memory, on the never-ending rehearsal of catastrophe. The first stage is trauma. The real and searing history of Jewish suffering, pogroms, statelessness, and above all the Holocaust, etched into the DNA of a modern state. It is not a fiction. It is not to be trivialized, but neither is it sacred. Because when trauma is made sacred, it cannot be questioned. And when it cannot be questioned, it can be weaponized. From this wound flows the second stage, projection. The pain that was once suffered is no longer seen in oneself, but in the other. Fear is cast outward. Palestinians become the new fascists. Iranians the new Nazis. Any resistance is framed as existential hatred. The terror that once came from Europe is now said to live in Gaza, in Beirut, in Tehran. The enemy is always another mirror, distorted and dark, but always useful. The third stage is preemption. Fear is not endured, it is acted upon, not after, but before, not in response, but in anticipation. Violence is reframed as vigilance. The past becomes prophecy, and prophecy becomes license. We must never be powerless again becomes we must never allow the possibility of threat. This is not defense, it is theater, but a theater where the weapons are real and the deaths are not staged. Then comes dehumanization. The moral cost of violence must be lowered, and so those targeted are stripped of full personhood. A Palestinian is not a student, a parent, a dreamer, but a potential militant. An Iranian is not a poet, a scientist, a citizen, but a fanatic in waiting. And if they are killed, their death is regrettable, but expected. Because what matters is not who they are, but what they represent. an echo of a threat we fear more than we can admit. Finally, the pattern reaches its most obscene culmination: mirror creation. The very thing that was feared is now produced by the state, by its bombs, by its walls, by its doctrine. The ghetto becomes the checkpoint. The memory of statelessness becomes a machinery of displacement. The Holocaust becomes the justification for permanent siege. And yet, there is no recognition, no admission. Because the mirror, once created, is never looked into, only imposed. This is not merely a case of national hypocrisy. It is structural. It is ritual. It is a sacrament of power disguised as survival. Trauma is not healed. It is curated. Projection is not psychological. It is geopolitical. Fear is not calmed. It is kept alive, like a sacred fire, like a national relic. Every war becomes a renewal of the liturgy. We are the eternal victims. Our enemies are irrational. Our violence is moral. Your criticism is anti-Semitism. The machinery is brilliantly constructed. Immunity cloaked in suffering. Exceptionalism shrouded in pain. A theology of exemption, built not on righteousness, but on the refusal to grieve honestly. So long as the trauma remains untouched, the pattern remains unbroken. The Holocaust becomes both shield and sword. Auschwitz becomes the ghost haunting every drone strike. Never again becomes a curse upon others. And here lies the rot. Power is sought not to prevent suffering, but to redistribute it. Not to end victimhood, but to monopolize it. Not to protect life, but to ensure that only some lives matter. And those who die under the weight of this doctrine, the Gazan child, the Iranian engineer, the Lebanese villager, are written off not only politically, but metaphysically. They are not just casualties of war. They are seen as necessary losses for the preservation of something more sacred: Israeli innocence. This is the high crime of projection, to reproduce the conditions of one's own historical suffering, while insisting one is still the victim. It is moral nihilism disguised as eternal vigilance. And the worst part is, it works. In Washington, Israel is sanctified. In American media, its narrative is taken as gospel. In liberal institutions, dissent is marked for exile. In conservative circles, it is fused with divine destiny. The machine is not broken. It is working. It is precise. It is bipartisan. And as the pattern repeats, each time with greater cruelty and cleaner language, the world forgets what started it. Not because it is unclear, but because to remember would require the one thing the machine cannot allow: recognition. Conclusion. Empires rarely say what they are. They perform what they fear. And in that performance, they write the story that justifies the blood. Israel has become not just a nation, but a theater. A permanent stage upon which the drama of fear is rehearsed again and again. Not only for domestic audiences, but for the world. And the world, especially the West, keeps clapping. The script is familiar. The only Jewish state is under threat. A new Holocaust is always around the corner. Every Palestinian is a terrorist in waiting. Every Iranian scientist a nuclear priest. Every critic a conspirator. The threat is always imminent. The violence always reluctant. The blood always regrettable. But the outcome is always the same. Dead children in Gaza. Mutilated bodies in Beirut. Assassinated scientists in Tehran. And cities burning. The performance is not symmetrical. It is not reciprocal. It is empire pretending to be prey. This is what makes it so powerful. American empire, too, thrives on this illusion that its wars are defensive, that its drones are surgical, that its victims are subhuman, that its soldiers are burdened saints. And in Israel, America sees itself perfected. A nation born in trauma, licensed to dominate. A frontier state that builds walls and names them peace. A people who suffered genocide, now incapable of committing one. This is the asymmetric theater of modern imperialism, where the powerful claim fear and the weak are labeled dangerous, where resistance is called terror and domination is called self-defense, where the one holding the gun insists he is afraid. And so the world is made upside down. A bulldozer runs over a home, and we are told it is a security operation. A child throws a stone, and we are told it is an existential threat. A journalist is shot in the head, and we are told it was a mistake. But it is not a mistake. It is the logic of the theater. And it depends on one thing, that the audience never walks out. That we keep watching, that we keep believing, that we keep mistaking performance for reality. But some of us have seen too much. Some of us no longer believe the script. Some of us have watched the actors rehearse too many times. And we know this is not fear, it is choreography. The threat is real, but not the one they name. The real threat is the one inside the actor, the one he cannot bear to face, the one called history, the one called shame, the one called what we have become. Until that is faced, the bombs will keep falling, and we will keep calling it peace. But the blood remembers, the ruins remember, the dead remember, and the theater, like all theaters, will one day collapse. Because the lie cannot hold forever. Even the best performance ends. Elias Winter, author of Language Matters, a space for reflection on language, power, and decline.